Thanks for joining us for this session on Populism, is the tide over yet? So we're going to change things up a little bit with this session. Talking to the panelists, we've hijacked the session to a certain extent, and we're going to change the theme a bit. I think my general sense is that very few people would argue that the tide of populism is over, so we're going to try to instead have a conversation about the drivers of populism, about what democratic governments are doing to respond to populism. And to help us with that, we're going to pose a question to all of you throughout the session that you can weigh in on. We're going to frame it as, is the problem Western elites or the voters? And you can go on Slido, on the app, on the web, and answer that question throughout this session. We'll show the results of the answer to that question later on. Just to frame that topic before I call my panelists to the stage, late last year, there was a poll in the US of American voters, and it showed that 59% of Americans said that this was, quote, the lowest point in our nation's history. And that was a majority of Americans across all generations. That included younger Americans who lived through 9/11, that included Americans who lived through the Vietnam War, and even the World War II generation. That sort of frustration about people's place in life, about their aspirations for the future, I think is partly what drove people to support candidates like Donald Trump in 2016, and on the left, Bernie Sanders. You still see a lot of this foment in American politics, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in a minute. You've seen similar anger and frustration at democratic governments across Europe. In Western Europe, Brexit, in the French and German elections, obviously in Central Europe, in Italy. And the impact of all of that is not just on our own democratic politics and a question about whether we're providing solutions to the voters and responding to their demands. It's obviously impacting our foreign policy debates and the fact that we even have to spend time in a security conference like this discussing these issues. So we're going to touch on all of those issues here today. And to do that, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. So immediately here, actually in the second from your right, we have Jakub Wisniewski, who's the Vice President of GlobeSec, who's Director of the GlobeSec Policy Institute. To his right, we have Martina Larkin, who's Head of Europe and Eurasia at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. We then have Randy Schoeneman on the far end, who's a member of the Board of Directors of the International Republican Institute in Washington, D.C. And immediately to my left, we have Sophie Gaston, who's Deputy Director of Demos in London. So what we're going to do is try to have a conversation that involves all of you. So even as I start the conversation with the panelists, you're welcome to go on Slido and submit questions that I'll see here and can incorporate into the conversation. We'll eventually pull in other contributions from the audience as well. And I think so here we actually have the first results of the vote, which shows that at least this audience thus far is already perhaps self-blaming and blames the elites for the tide of populism. So we'll see if that changes during the conversation. So I'm going to start off with Sophie, who's been doing a lot of interesting work doing focus groups and looking at voter views, especially in Europe, but has also written a lot about some of the drivers of populism, including the politics of fear. So Sophie, why don't you talk a little bit about your perceptions about what has been driving populism in Western democracies, especially in Europe?
Thank you. I think really it's a confluence of factors. Essentially, if you compound together a kind of economic insecurity, social insecurity, cultural insecurity, and together with a mistrust in our political institutions, you create quite fertile ground for populist messages and candidates to succeed. And I think really at the heart of all of this is a sense that really that politicians are no longer able to actually affect positive change in people's lives. I think people are fundamentally believing now that there is something rotten at the heart of their societies, and also that their political systems are sort of systemically corrupt. And, obviously there is a huge level of diversity in the actual levels of endemic corruption in different countries. But even in advanced liberal Western democracies, with the institutions that other developing countries are seeking to emulate, citizens are really feeling that there is something kind of fundamentally broken at the heart of their society and their politics. So I think, when you have all of these factors coming together, and then you have incredibly skillful politicians and campaigns who can really speak to these fundamental concerns and anxieties. Populists are incredibly good at raising conversations that political elites have been too cautious to engage with. And so often when you're talking to citizens, they would say things like, oh, well, he speaks the truth. He stands up for his country. He's not afraid to say it like it is. So I think, it's very important that we listen to citizens when we're actually diagnosing what's happening with populism. I think too often political leaders are listening to the populist parties themselves. What they should be doing is spending more time with citizens and trying to understand not just what they think, but all the myriad factors that have gone into forming those opinions.
Martina, why don't you pick up on that, and how much of what we've seen with the success of various populist parties in Europe do you think is directly tied to economic concerns, or is it much more diverse set of issues?
So I think certainly there's a huge factor related to the economic disparities and the inequality that we're seeing, and the absence of really inclusive growth, particularly in Europe. Just generally people feeling left behind, and the lack of control that they have over events that take place, and sort of the costs of their lives, and the decline of their wages and all of that. But there's also other factors that we see that really contribute this. In Europe, of course, it's migration, but more globally also it's the lack of trust in political, but also other institutions, business and other leaders, even the media, of course. And from our perspective also, these rapid technological changes, the fourth industrial revolution, as we coin it, really has contributed to this fear and feeling of lack of control that people have, and the uncertainty about their jobs, about their lives, about the work that they could potentially have in the future, really has contributed to the feeling of disconnect and the rise of populism, particularly in Europe.
Jakob, coming from Central Europe, I'm interested to hear your perspective about how you view the populism and the results that we've seen here in Central Europe differently or similarly to what's been going on in Western Europe or in the US.
Well, some of evolution is systemic and is the same for all of us. So there is a common denominator for Brexit Britain, Trump America, and Kaczyński's Poland. It's about economics. I might be accused of sounding Marxist, but I believe this economic base has a profound impact. Let me mention unorthodox counter-cyclical policies. In monetary policy, you can feel later the consequences as regards disparities of income in the population, the economics of superstars, slump in labor participation after the crisis that has not gone up afterwards, technological change that resulted in the change of a structure of labor market, and this all results in rebellion from blue-collar workers, disoriented people, and also culture wars that are coming back with vehemence. And when I mentioned the culture wars, I'm very much coming back to the question of Central Eastern Europe, which had a crash course of modernization after downfall of communism, but apparently it was not enough for the society to imbibe standards of or rules of a democratic process, certain checks and balances that are normally typical for the Western type of democracy. So what I mean is that we are all going through the stormy seas, but boats in Central Europe are much more easily unbalanced. So when we see populism in, say, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, but also the country we are here in Slovakia, it is much more forceful and it's much more dangerous because there is no backstop in the form of institutions, media that is sufficiently developed to withstand the pressure of the populists.
Randy, why don't you talk a little bit about what's going on in the US in terms of the assessment of the success of Trump? Picking up on Jakob's point, he mentioned culture wars. I think there's an element of that in the US conversation, but interested to hear your thoughts on the US debate.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to emphasize I'm speaking on my own behalf here, not representing IRI, even though I'm honored to serve on the board of the International Republican Institute. I think there's a tendency in the United States in particular to think that every phenomenon is new, and therefore that the Trump phenomenon is somehow new and different from long traditions in American political history. I mean, we've had populists going back to the 1890s. We had Huey Long in the 1930s. We had George Wallace in the 1960s. And more recently, we've had a number of populist sounding candidates, and I'm not just referring to Bernie Sanders in the last election. In fact, I wanted to read a quotation I found interesting, and it is as follows. "We need jobs here. We need to manufacture here if we wish to remain a superpower. Our highest foreign policy priority is to get our house back in order and to make America work again." Sound familiar? That was Ross Perot in 1992, a billionaire who actually made things rather than ran a family branding business. But there has been more recently in American politics a reaction to some of the cultural and economic insecurities that have been going on. The major parties have been seen not to address them. I was intrigued by the number of you that responded. The problem is the elites, not the voters. I think the major parties, even if the people voting in this room don't reflect it, the major parties have been in complete denial about what the problem is, the lack of opportunity for the middle class. On the left, it's generally defined as income inequality. So for Bernie Sanders, the enemies were banks and billionaires. On the right, at least in then candidate Trump's view, it was a different type of other, principally the threat of Mexican migration, but also the sense that the system is rigged. Remember that, and I'll close with this, remember that in the final days running up to the election, then candidate Trump repeatedly predicted that the system was rigged and the election was going to be stolen. We didn't obviously hear that after Election Day.
I want to go back to the rest of the panel. Do you all agree that this is just another part of a cyclical cycle, or do any of you think that there's something unique going on here that's fundamentally different than some of the examples that Randy cited in the past, at least in the American context?
I think, what we're seeing, and there are two kind of core constituencies that I'm seeing, and I've just been doing this huge suite of focus groups for a project on nostalgia, which is obviously intrinsically linked to a lot of the populist discourses at the moment. And, the two core constituencies there with a propensity for nostalgia are either people who've lived in kind of deindustrialized towns and cities and have gone through themselves a process of change and lived that. And there's also this other, probably even larger group of people for whom it's more about a kind of cultural and social insecurity, which is around the processes of change, and it's demographic change, it's political correctness, it's cultural pluralism. And the things that they keep saying to me is they're stressed, they're exhausted, they feel that they're constantly needing to adapt. So I think both of these processes represent the end of a period. One of them is sort of the end of a kind of globalization, one is sort of the end of this deindustrialization. They're both obviously linked. But I think there is something unique about what's happening now in that respect, because even in the deindustrialized towns, their concerns are not just about the jobs that they lost. It's not just material. It's also about all these other cultural things that went along with it, the sense of community that they had, the sense of status that they had, political agency. So there is an emotional dimension. I think that said, I don't think this is the last time that we will see this. We are about to, as you alluded, we're about to embark on another huge economic transformation. So I think we've got every reason to believe that we will be experiencing this again.
Martina?
Yeah, so obviously it's not a new phenomenon, and we've seen modern populism since the 19th century, but I do think there are certain elements that are quite unique or have sort of reached a tipping point. Of course, one of them around this technological revolution, but I think you've alluded to it. There's lack of, at least in Europe, this sense of a lack of identity and loss of identity, which is really quite a profound shift, which I would argue wasn't, at least at the beginning of the 20th century, certainly not the same in Europe as it is now. And this will have much more profound impact on this search for some sort of meaning or identity. And of course, it's very simple and very easy to find the easy solutions that some of these populist leaders provide, and quite comforting, I guess, for people who do feel that there's a complete lack of control and loss of identity and loss of a lot of things that they took for granted, or at least the previous generations did.
Jakob, the one interesting thing about the Central European experience is that loss of identity was mentioned. Well, in the past, in the West, we used to define our identity by those in the non-West or the authoritarians. Now you have, in Central Europe, you have aspects of this in the US debate, even about Europe. We're kind of defining ourselves by how we're not like other democracies to a certain extent. Can you talk about that a little bit in the Central European case?
Well, it saddens me to hear statements from politicians who distance themselves from the Western liberal democratic order. I believe this is a post-Soviet disease. This is something that I would expect to hear from President Putin, sovereign democracy, etc. I don't buy this argument. I don't see any logic, so it's very difficult for me to justify the reason behind it. I think it's simply pragmatic. It's not. It's cynical. There is no belief in the real difference of Central or Eastern model of democracy, Central European or Eastern European model of democracy. And let me just chip in to the previous question. Every human has this tendency to believe that the time and place they live in is special. I don't neglect the current wave of populism, but look at the previous century. By the standards of the 20th century, we are doing pretty fine. 2 world wars arising out of populism. And as regards progress of technology, which might be also dangerous, we can deal with social media if we dealt with radio and television as a source of certain threats. Let me remind you that in the 1930s, American radio played Orson Welles' invasion of aliens, and people were really scared. They believed that this is what is happening for real. And so you can create panic, you can distort people's views, but with the decent standards of democracy, we can handle it.
Some of you on Slido are beginning to shift where I wanted to take the conversation next, which is looking at how we respond to the populist challenge. Someone anonymous commented, you can exchange elites but not the voters, which maybe explains why we're seeing some of the results that we did. Others are asking questions about how we educate and raise broader awareness about public policy amongst voters. So Randy, turning to you, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about what's going on in the US right now in response to the success of Donald Trump, the surprising success of someone like Senator Sanders in the Democratic primary. What can we do to respond to all of these concerns, that the myriad of concerns that have been highlighted by all of you on this panel?
Well, a couple of things in response. I mean, first of all, the parties that so woefully failed to understand the concerns of these voters, not surprisingly, are not fully responding now. The Republicans, which are in power, have hardly embraced a major populist agenda that would somehow help the factory worker in Ohio or the blue-collar worker in Nevada whose job has been lost. I mean, we passed a big tax reform package whose benefits principally go to the large corporations that have been the biggest supporters of a free trade agenda that voters by and large feel somehow has cost them jobs. On the Democratic side, it's fascinating. People love to talk about, I mean, Trump essentially engaged in a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. He was a Democrat far longer than he was a Republican, but he very effectively came in using the kinds of messages that everyone's familiar with and captured the Republican nomination. On the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders obviously almost won if the process maybe had been more fair from his perspective. He may have won the nomination. It's clear now the civil war in the Democratic Party is moving it far to the left, and you see that in primaries as recently as a few days ago, where establishment endorsed candidates are being beaten in primaries by political neophytes. So I think both parties are trying to work through this. I'm not sure either party, certainly the Democrats aren't there yet in terms of what they're going to propose and what their agenda is going to be. Going into our midterm elections, which are coming up in November, the Democratic agenda is talk about the Russia investigation and whatever Trump's latest outrageous tweets are, and they think that will carry him to victory, and it may. But for the Republicans, I don't think they have come up with kind of the comprehensive or even minimally responsive answers to the concerns about economic dislocation, immigration, et cetera.
Sophie, you've done a lot of fieldwork in Europe, and as Randy showed, I think in the US we're still grappling with what the right response is to a lot of these frustrations, and the reality is a lot of them cannot be addressed by government, and a lot of jobs are not going to come back to certain communities, or the type of jobs that are going to be there are going to be fundamentally different. Have you seen in your work in Europe any examples where the people in your focus groups are pointing to one politician and saying that person is addressing my concerns right now?
Well, when they do, they're usually populists, which is a problem. And I think if we look at the mainstream parties, you know, the social fragmentation that we're seeing in our societies in the West is only matched by our political polarization. And it obviously exacerbates our social fragmentation. And mainstream parties who are feeling absolutely under siege in this age of populism are now clinging to this sort of, you know, this kind of issues-based agenda, which only focuses on what divides us. So we're just perpetuating this cycle. The one person who seems to be making some of the right moves is Emmanuel Macron, and that is because he seems to be striking a somewhat better balance between sort of pursuing a liberal agenda, but while also trying to reconcile cosmopolitanism with patriotism and all of these other symbols of community that are important to people. I mean, people want to feel proud of their country. They want to express their nationalism. This comes up again and again in focus groups. So I think he's doing better. And certainly in some of the recent focus groups I've been doing there, even Le Pen voters are kind of, you know, I mean, I think the country, citizens fundamentally recognize that they have a chance to turn the country around. So people are cautiously throwing their support behind it.
Mm-hmm. Martina, one of the questions submitted from the audience is focused on, can clear positive messages fight this populist trend? And so you could argue, though, that the populists actually are all about slogans, but then not actually about delivering. Do you think there's anything to just the way that establishment or conventional politicians talk about policy that if they change the slogans and the style, that somehow they'll get broader support?
Well, I think in the end, it's not about the slogans only. It's also about the delivery, and they just haven't really delivered for the people. I think that's the main issue, that they haven't really had the impact on the people that they wanted. And so, you know, we need to be, or you know, the elites and the leaders, both in the political and also in the business world, just need to make sure that we have more inclusive growth, that we give people, especially the next generation, younger people, the same chances the previous generations had, that we, you know, bridge the rural and the sort of city divides, that we really build a future which is exciting, which is driven through innovation, growth, new technologies which deliver benefits to the people, not just sort of fear and dangerous sort of new technologies they don't know how to cope with.
Jakob, in the Central European cases, I mean, how do you see the leaders that have been elected as part of this wave actually, are they really addressing the concerns that got them into office?
Partly they were elected on a ticket, but made them popular. Look at Poland, handouts to families were actually needed as a social assistance. And I draw a certain lessons from that. I believe that all these countries that are suffering from populism have a problem with social policy. We need a revamped welfare state. Not necessarily spending more, not necessarily giving more in terms of handouts, but being more engaged, active, looking out for these left behind and trying to come up with an offer for them. Maybe in area of education, maybe in area of early school care or child care. But this is all which is building up the confidence of people and creating a buffer against uncertainty in people's lives. And this is something that elites disregarded for several years. They just looked at the GDP growth, which was doing nicely, but it didn't trickle down to the lowest strata of society. I also believe that we need to think we need to listen to societies. We need to give change to people as they want in terms of, for example, how the democratic system works. Maybe traditional parties have used up themselves, which means that we need some more innovation in this. But something is sacred, and this is the constitution. Nobody has agreed to change drastically the model of democracy, I guess, in every country that is suffering from populism.
So I want to bring the audience in directly here in a minute, but before I do that, I'll throw one final question for right now to the panel. We have a question on Slido basically making the point that isn't populism an omnipresent part of political life? And shouldn't we focus on the more extreme versions of populism that are more nativist and xenophobic? I guess this leads into the question of, is there a responsible populism? Isn't politics all about populism at the end of the day? And shouldn't we want leaders who kind of inspire a populist response, but do so and channel their energies towards responsible policies? So it's more of a definitional, I guess, debate about what populism is. But does anyone want to, Randy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, what politicians are supposed to do is be responsive to the people. Now, that doesn't mean they simply act as an agent of the people. In certain times, it requires leadership that might be unpopular. But by and large, what politicians are supposed to do is address the concerns of real voters, not express disdain for those voters. I mean, a German voter that is concerned about a rapid influx of Syrian refugees settled in his or her village very logically might decide, you know, I'm not going to vote for the Christian Democrats. I am going to vote for the party that says this is a problem. And so they vote for AfD. That doesn't make them a neo-Nazi. In the American context, voters that happen to believe in God or believe in the Second Amendment to our Constitution about the right to keep and bear arms have very legitimate concerns. They're not people who, quote, cling to their guns and religion. That's a quotation from then Senator Barack Obama in the 2008 campaign. So I agree, we need to listen to the voters and not treat them as deplorables. That's a quote more recently from Hillary Clinton.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question of responsible populism?
Very quickly, I want to say something about immigration, because this is a question that answer cannot easily be found. In a way, every economist will tell you that we can handle many more people, both in Europe and America. Our systems are capable of attracting these people, integrating them, etc. But somehow societies are rebelling because of mentality, because of culture. And this is where we might look for solutions that also include addressing this requirement of cutting down on immigration. My heart aches to say this because I'm a big proponent of migratory flows, but still if people cannot handle it in terms of their mentality, in terms of their mindsets, something needs to be done. The example is 2004 Britain, when labor market was opened. People from Central Eastern Europe came in many and in big numbers, and maybe today Brexit is the consequences of that.
So I want to get towards the end to a brief discussion about how this all fits back into global security and foreign policy, especially of transatlantic democracies. But I want to bring everyone from the audience in, give everyone the opportunity. I think I have Robin Shepard here in the front, and we believe we have a microphone that'll be coming.
Thanks, Jamie, and thank you to all the panelists for some very interesting interventions about this subject. I'm working on a book project on democracy in the digital revolution, and I was, since a lot of my research, I'm going through books where the words democracy, digital, and revolution never make it into the same sentence, and usually not into the index. I was almost tempted to wait to make the last question to see whether you guys would get through the whole of this without saying the digital revolution. I know Martina did bring it up very briefly, as did Jakub. It seems to me that is the elephant in the room, and it answers the question, in my mind, that Jamie raised about whether this is a cyclical matter. I put to all of the panelists that it is not, that this is a one-time shift, and the reason is that we are living amidst a revolution as significant as the move from rural to urban society, from agrarian to settled society, that this is something which is world historic, and that all of the things that you talk about are very important, very interesting, and are contributory factors, but unless one actually gets to grip with the fact that it is the possibility to imagine a different kind of political economy. This is way beyond the question of social media and Facebook. A meritocratic, if you like, a meritocratic zeitgeist that is emerging amidst all the problems we're aware of in contemporary politics. And if we don't actually put the digital revolution at the center rather than at the periphery, let alone make it the boogeyman, which is what a lot of people in establishment circles do, then we are never going to really understand that this isn't just something like it was 50 years ago or 20 years ago, that this really is a one-time shift. So I put that point to all of the panelists to take as they would like to.
Who wants to? Randy?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take the start of a crack at it. It is no coincidence the first example of populism I cited from America in the 1890s was at a time when we were doing the exact shift that Robin referred to from the agricultural to the industrial revolution. The much vaunted techlash, or the backlash against tech companies in the United States, as of yet, does not have a big populist flair. But I think it's only a matter of time. And if you look at the massive transfer of wealth over the last 30 years from the middle of the United States to the coasts, most recently, much of that due to the digital revolution, the creation of new super multi-billionaires, modern-day robber barons are called by some, the heads of Amazon, Facebook, Google, et cetera. How can you talk about income inequality and not talk about the vast agglomeration of wealth by these profit-making companies, although they publicly have very high-minded goals? I think it's only a matter of time before you see that. Not to mention the absolute destruction of the retail industry and all the jobs that entails in the United States from a company like Amazon. So I think it's only a matter of time before there is a backlash that hits at those. That doesn't directly answer what you talked about, what happens and what does the economy look like down the road with robotics and artificial intelligence costing even more jobs as that becomes more and more prevalent. A very, very difficult question that I'm certainly not smart enough to figure out.
Sophie?
The reason I've been looking into nostalgia at the moment is because it's a challenge for governance, because governance in its simplest form is essentially about managing change. And if I look ahead to this next enormous economic transformation that lies ahead, it concerns me that we have large swathes of our population who are becoming not necessarily just nostalgic. Actually, the proportion of people who literally want to go back to the past is relatively small, but very large groups of people who are resistant to further change. And if we know this change is coming, then that is a huge problem. And I think what really troubles me is that I don't think many governments are getting on the front foot of this. I mean, absolutely transformative effects of this on things like our education system, our skills system. We're not seeing any of the kind of agitations to get on the front foot around that. There's no proactive thinking really, because we're still in the mindset of incremental change. So I think you're absolutely right. It is the elephant in the room, and I don't think that the crop of political leaders we have at the moment are being bold enough. I think there are a lot of politicians now, whether it's in Britain or Macron or even, you know, Merkel, a bit kind of starting to engage with this issue of automation, but they're not willing to stamp the kind of structural change that is going to be necessary. And I think that's partly because we're not even having those political conversations yet. At the moment, most of the engagement with this issue is, look at all the tremendous economic benefits that this can bring. We're going to be on the forefront of this. We will be the world's leading hub for high-tech digital manufacturing. Nobody's having the difficult conversations about not even just the economic, but the social aspects of managing that change.
I think we see a lot of that certainly in the US context of politicians running away from that conversation rather than having it. We have another question here in the middle, but I just was told that the votes are actually shifting a bit. So there's now 1/3 of you, or a little bit over 1/3, now blame the voters, which I think is more actually than when we started, a little bit over half an hour ago. So with that, we'll go to the person there and about halfway.
Yes, hello, I'm Alexis Leenders. I'm part of the GlobSec Young Leaders Forum. And we want to, you know, take this opportunity to get in on the discussion because it's, of course, also our future. So this is a very interesting discussion. And thank you to the speakers and the moderator for doing a very good job in pointing to the different drivers. Now, we've been talking about populism and the future of Europe and the future of the European Union for the past few days. And one of the things that really struck us was that when if politicians defend the European Union, it's mostly about the past. It's about, you know, the European Union has created this peace for so many years, it has created welfare, etc., etc. Now, but when it comes to the fears of people, they're about the future. They're about what are we going to lose with this huge transformation that we're looking at. And one of the things that we were wondering is, how can we actually create a narrative, create a messaging about the European Union that is more forward-looking, that is more pointed towards the future? And if the identity topic needs to be addressed, how do we also create a narrative about this without it being exclusive and rather inclusive?
Anyone want to tackle Martina?
Yeah, I would, and I wanted to make a point also about what you said, especially the point about democracies and democracy in itself. And while we might all agree that there is definitely, you know, populism is here to stay, what does it mean for the future of democracy? Freedom House did a research where they showed that 19 out of 29 democratic economies have a decline in their scores of democracy. I think it's an interesting concept to consider how the two link and what it means for democracies in the future. On the point of identity and the future of Europe, we did a study and a report last year about a new concept for Europe, recognizing that we need to really rethink the future of Europe. And we definitely didn't come to any final conclusion or the perfect narrative, but clearly the inclusion of the next generation and youth from across the region is incredibly important, and having a more positive future-oriented outlook, and perhaps also being much more conscious of making sure that Europe also provides leadership role in areas that it has been leading, whether that's climate change, sustainability, and other things where we can be much more prominent in terms of showing pride and leadership and showing the way forward, which I think will then, in essence, provide a new narrative and identity, which is not sort of the post-war and peace talk that doesn't really resonate with this generation right now.
We have a Brit and American who I'm assuming have very few contributions to the discussion about how to make a better case for the EU, but Jakob, if you have anything.
Someone said very useful thing about liberalism, and I guess liberalism can be connected to the European Union agenda, but the message should be clearer, shorter, and more vulgar. When I say vulgar, I don't mean bad language, but I mean message which is not maybe about lofty ideas, but were real down-to-earth benefits that the European Union is bringing. I am sick of language of Antici, Coreper, and all these institutions, and I'm bored with it, and I'm simply horrified by how all these statesmen and bureaucrats can make such a interesting and fascinating subject as the European Union, and also the reality of it, how they can make it so boring. So we have a long way to go, and the European Commission has been trying, but it's not enough, and we are very, very far away from the goal.
You certainly do not have a boring political conversation in the US right now. It's perhaps too exciting, but the next question is right here.
Thank you. My name is Miguel Cabrera. I'm with Good AI, and we have a long-term research program on artificial intelligence. And because we are a serious company, we're looking really into the social impacts. There's been to be shared view that one of the main sources of insecurity in the population is rapid development of technology, and people are just not able to keep with the pace of the change. With the further development of technology, we're kind of seeing that this will actually even accelerate. So the situation will not get better, we will not stop innovation, but just the innovation will be faster and faster, because especially artificial intelligence will allow us to actually accelerate the speed of discovery, now being used in medicine, but in the other fields, and it's just a question of time and it will enter all the spheres of scientific research. What we are seeing is that not only the population is not able to keep up the pace of the change, but the elites are not able to keep up the pace of the change. So my question more goes to what we could do actually with the elites, how we can work with the elites in order to actually support better decision making and support even thinking and help the elites to understand the technological developments. It's not only about what Randy was mentioning, that, okay, we might witness the backlash to the very large players very soon. But we will not be able to stop innovation because we are in the global competitive environment. So if the others do innovate, we will have to innovate as well. So we would need the leaders to understand this and understand where the innovation is actually taking us. What can we do about it?
So what can we do to promote conversation about where the digital revolution, things like AI, are going to take the conversation? We also had a question on Slido about the ideological polarization of the news media, the bubbles that we see in many of our societies, and the fact that people are only engaging often on social media or even through, in the US, cable news with people and hearing views from people they agree with and not being challenged. So who wants to take that on? Sophie?
Yeah, to your point, I think it's a huge challenge. We've been grappling with this a little bit in Britain, actually producing some sort of quite simple, accessible briefing papers for MPs to start to engage with these issues, and having kind of closed workshops where we sort of try and set it out, because the problem is it's not just the Minister for Digital who's going to have to go up on the big political show of the week. It could be some random backbencher who has to come out and there's been a terror attack and they're asked about WhatsApp and should we ban encryption, and they're sort of scrambling, and then all of a sudden you end up with a government policy that we're going to ban encryption. So it's just, we need to think about the education. I think that private sector and NGOs have a huge role to play in that. They need to be opening up those conversations with government. I think they're receptive to it. My concern is that they're not necessarily receptive to looking at the bad news stories at the moment. So I think, again, we sort of need to push and agitate a bit on that. I think on the polarization point, it's absolutely true. And people say, well, hang on. I mean, especially in Britain, we've always had these incredibly partisan newspapers, for example. What's the difference between being a Telegraph reader and, being in a filter bubble echo chamber now, 10 years later? The difference is that now, because of the way algorithms work in the digital age, which kind of skew content towards your preferences, it creates an impression of consensus. And that's where it becomes dangerous. That's where a filter bubble becomes sort of self-reinforcing and closes itself off. So I think it's an absolutely huge problem. The solutions to it are difficult and varied. We've been doing some work with kind of organizations that work with very young people and schools and all the rest. The big challenge is, how do you reach the adult population? And I think we need some more campaigns that perhaps focus on encouraging people to read things they disagree with, because that generally means you're not in an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm. Randy, do you want to talk about the American perspective on this, especially coming from the Republican Party, because conservative media in the US is part of this, and there's also a similar echo chamber on the left, but the conservative bubble has now been exploited, as we found out post-2016, by foreign actors like the Russians, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go back a little bit and not think just about what's happened in the last 6 or 10 years. I mean, there's a reason Rupert Murdoch founded Fox News. And the reason is something like 80 to 85% of the reporters, journalists, broadcast and print that were working in the mainstream media were self-identified as liberals. And the idea that somehow that personal feeling of liberalism never infected the news was, to many conservatives, laughable. In the 2008 campaign, something like 15 people that covered the Obama presidential campaign then went into the Obama administration as political appointees. I mean, there is a reaction to that kind of thing to say, wait a minute, these people aren't objective truth tellers honoring the sacred First Amendment freedom of speech. They are, in fact, partisans. What you have seen now is a completely partisan media on both sides. I like to call the conservative news network RT Fox because of where they seem to come out on most things Russia today, and if you turn on MSNBC, all you hear about is a Russia investigation, no matter what natural disasters might have happened or whatever might have happened elsewhere in the world. Like Sophie, I'm not sure there is an easy answer for it, and Jamie, I take your point that that's created vulnerabilities. I mean, personally, I think anybody that gets their news solely off of Facebook is what creates the vulnerability if you're going to rely on that medium that is respondent to advertising, clickbait, et cetera, and fake news that's mocked up to look like the Denver Chronicle or whatever. You create a vulnerability. I don't know what the answer is to that.
We have a little under 10 minutes, so I've got one final question here, and I'll have one question for the panel.
Hello, my name's James Sproul. I'm from the Gotham Street in London. I'm wondering if people really do hate the elite, or they hate the disdainful elite, and I draw a distinction between those two. So really, is the problem income inequality, or is it a cultural war? And the way in which people embrace the things that actually have added to these coastal billionaires, etc. And I've said a number of times in seminars that I've been running, if you don't like the fact that the high street, the commercial street in your town is being undermined, then stop shopping on Amazon, because that's what's killing it. And everybody goes sort of nods, but then they go home and they hit, one-click ordering because it's just so easy. So I wonder, is the solution here, can self-interest trump populism, is really my question. And maybe it can and maybe it can't, I don't know. But I think it's a question worth asking.
Martina, do you want to tackle that?
Well, I think we really need to look also at how communication, to the earlier point about how things are communicated, really gets through to people, and the responsibility also people have. You alluded to this. So while on one hand, for example, in the communications aspect, of course, it's hugely liberating. Everybody has access now to all the media, can also be an expert on media, can post and tweet and do whatever they want. They do have a responsibility in terms of how they consume, but also, report on the news. And also, we don't really have the norms for the truth and sort of the integrity and values that we should stand up for. And that also then applies to the same thing you alluded to about, simple things like shopping. You can, disagree with this, high street things and all of that. But then if you're not part of the solution, then what type of responsibility do you have? And I think this is something that we need to really be much more conscious of. Also, when we look at the next generation and how we convey this type of responsible and responsive leadership. It's this responsibility that we all carry, I think, whether it's the elites, but also I think the citizens themselves, because they make choices, and increasingly they can make choices, the way they consume, the way they communicate, the way they work, and how they also provide leadership in their own communities.
So I'll pose one final question to the panel. While we've had these questions coming in from the audience, the blame of the voters has been steadily creeping up. If we kept on going, I think we might actually end up blaming the voters.
They're listening to me too much.
But I'm interested in turning this back to the broader security conversation going on at this conference. And at the end of the day, the fact that we're now having these inward-focused conversations about what's going on in transatlantic democracy has national security implications, because we as transatlantic democracies are not able to address some of the global challenges, the changing global landscape. We also are more vulnerable to attack, as we've now seen, from Russian interference and across the transatlantic space. China is just looming over the horizon as well. How do we turn this conversation around and both address some of the core concerns and then also, once again, inspire our voters to actually be interested in leading in the world? I think it's certainly a conversation that we're interested in America. I think it's a challenge for Europe as well. So any final thoughts about that from the panel before we close?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Jamie. One thing that didn't come up either as a question or in your lead-in is the question of isolationism, which has been recurrent at conferences like this for many years. America getting more isolationist. And if you look at Trump voters, yeah, there's a war weariness factor, but there's not necessarily a don't engage with the world. I mean, what Walter Russell Mead, who's now at the Hudson Institute, kind of categorized as Jacksonian voters. They don't want to engage with our enemies, they want to kill them. And so Trump voters were very supportive of the war on ISIS. There was no backlash about doing something in response to chemical weapons attack in Syria. So they're not isolationists, they're not anti-engagement. On the Russia factor, I mean, despite all the publicity about, and the investigations, the main one of which, the Mueller investigation, is still ongoing about whether there was collusion or not in the Trump campaign, the Russia policy of the Trump administration, I would argue, is much tougher than the Obama administration policy. I mean, we're increasing significantly the presence in forward presence in Central and Eastern Europe. Sanctions are tougher than ever, largely a congressional initiative, giving Javelin anti-tank weapons to both the Ukrainians and the Georgians, something the Obama administration refused to do despite pressure. So I don't see it as an outcome that benefited whatever Russian interference took place, and it certainly did take place.
Jakob, do you want to?
I want to go back to my initial thought when I was talking about Central Europe and vulnerability. What rattles America or Britain can actually kill young democracies in Central or Eastern Europe. So any aggressive behavior from the revisionist powers, any intervention in the electoral process, any intervention so that the public moods go very radical, can have profound consequences for the membership of this country in military alliances or groupings like the European Union. So the point I'm making is the region to watch and follow closely is Central Europe. A lot of things are happening. I don't have a smoking gun, but I believe that the conspiracy theory about catastrophe of presidential plane in Smolensk, murder of a journalist Kuciak, and the follow-up in the media, both traditional and social media, can sometimes point to intervention from outside, and this is bad, and this is worrying, and we have to come up with solutions. We have to educate society to make people, especially young ones, to be prepared. But not everything is true of what is served to you.
We've got under 2 minutes, so Martina or Sophie, do you want to weigh in on this final question?
Well, I actually wanted to come back quickly on the point of what can be done, particularly when we look at these tectonic shifts that we're seeing on these technologies. And I think on one hand, yes, of course, you need to explain to people what is actually happening, not only the sort of risks and dangers, but also the opportunities and the positive sides. But the other aspect I think that's really important is around agile governance. We cannot have the same systems we had in the past to deal with these changes. We need to be much more agile. We need to develop systems that are much more flexible and agile in its governance, but also how we sort of look at implementing them and involving the people into that.
So I think we're about out of time. The final vote, it looks like 64% of those in the audience blame the populists' challenge on the elites and 36% on the voters. So we have a very introspective, I guess, audience here at GlobeSec. But please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for tackling this issue. So the next sessions that I should make you aware of, in the Danube space at 5 o'clock, there's a session on projecting power and the post-rule world order in Habsburg. There's a panel on beyond survival, disruptive tech in humanitarian aid. And in this room, there's a session on depth and darkness of the web. Thank you.